Here, where the land ends and the sea starts, the great Portuguese poet Luís de Camões leads us to discover the untouched beauty of the westernmost point of continental Europe, Capo da Roca. Further along the mighty Atlantic, we come to the city of Porto, the second largest city of Portugal, and also a UNESCO heritage site, as well as 3 times Europe's most popular tourist destination. So what is the connection between China and Portugal and the Portuguese-speaking world? How can the two sides enhance mutual understanding? Welcome to this very special edition of The Point with me, Vishin, coming to you from Porto in collaboration with the local TV channel Porto Canal. And my co-host today is Daniela Assunção. Yeah, it's a great pleasure to be in Porto and to work with you for this.
For us too.
Yeah, thank you. I'm really looking forward to it. So who are our guests today? Could you introduce them to us?
Yes, of course. To join us, António Leitão Amaro, our deputy leader from Social Democratic Party Parliamentary Group since 2015, and also an important card, Vice President of Portugal-China Parliamentary Friendship Group since 2016. Also, the professor Paula Africano at Porto University. Welcome. She has several publications related with exports and also innovations and economics. And last but not least, Lopes Ferreira. He is the CEO of Bock Group since 2015, one of the biggest exporters to China. Welcome, everyone.
Yeah, well, it's great. We have the political, the academic, and the business perspective, so it's going to be a very comprehensive look at the China-Portuguese relations. So China and Portugal have had over 500 years of relationship, ever since 1514, when Portuguese Jesuits and explorers and traders came to China. The modern relationship started in 1979 between the People's Republic of China and the Republic of Portugal. So I want to start by asking each one of you to tell your understanding of where we are in terms of bilateral ties from the political point of view first. Mr. Amaro.
Thank you very much, and welcome to Portugal and to Porto.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to have you here. So I would say that we have indeed an historical relationship of 500 years that were marked by always a peaceful relationship. That's very interesting and important. Our two countries that know each other for 500 years never entered a conflict against each other and had serious and substantive relationship along that time. But looking at the recent past and the present, I would say that mostly the 6-7 past years have been a time of a new high in our bilateral relationships. Mm-hmm. They were built on country-to-country basis, but also a people-to-people's base. And I think the common approach that both countries, governments, people, and companies decided to enter into is based on trust and an approach of accepting rules and merit-based way of interacting.
Well, in terms of political ties, I mean, you lead a parliamentary group to forge friendship with your Chinese counterpart. In terms of that level, what are we looking at this moment?
In Portugal, we change parties in the government quite often. And one important mark is that these trust and openness to the bilateral relationship between Portugal and China do not change when governments or parties change in government. So we have I can call it a bipartisan support to the strength of this bilateral relationship. It has been, at the same time, a process of improving and strengthening the relationship, but also of learning the differences between the two countries.
Professor Paula, taking into account your publications and your experience to the China market, what bridges and scholar programs are being implemented?
And our university is actually one of the top universities in Europe that promotes exchange programs for students, for staff, and I actually have Chinese students coming from Beijing University at my classes. So it's an example that we have exchange programs, extensive exchange programs with all parts of the world, but of course including China.
Great. Well, looking at the business side, Mr. Ferreira, you have been going into China since the past 10 years, and I understand that only during the past 5 years you started to take root and see fruition of your efforts. Where are we at this moment?
From a business point of view, I would say that I think we are at a very good level, a very good stage now. We feel that Portuguese investment and Portuguese activities in China are very welcome. We feel that there is a very good institutional environment that favors economic relations. We are having the support either of the Portuguese embassy in Beijing and also the Chinese embassy in Portugal. So we really feel that there is a positive mood, positive trend that is favoring relationships between Portugal and China. And of course, I think we are benefiting in our company of that. As I told you, we are in China for 10 years. Indeed, in the last 5 years, we have been more successful because we have been learning during the first years, and it was really necessary because there is a huge gap between China and Portugal.
How important is the China business for your company in Portugal?
Well, actually, China represents our main export market. So after domestic market, after Portugal, it's our most important market, which is where we are selling more than we sell, for instance, in all European countries. So, of course, this means that is really, really important for our strategy of internationalization, and is a very important part of our operation. That's why, for instance, we are now, at this moment, developing specific products, not only for Portugal, but specifically for China.
For China.
And this happened for the first time.
Let me ask you this common question for all the three of you, because I think from what you have said just now, China, or your interaction with China is in a relatively different level or on a different scale than with your interaction with your European counterparts or Western counterparts. What does it mean for today's Portugal to interact with China? What's the biggest difference that you are aware of, or how do you have to adapt because of that big difference in terms of politics, in terms of academic exchanges, in terms of business? Just now you talked about producing a China-specific beer, right? A special favor. In terms of parliamentary exchanges, do you have to be very specialized as well when dealing with China?
I would say that so our interaction is parliamentarian, but goes beyond parliament. It goes government to government, and for sure that we know, and I think it's in our blood as Portuguese, as a global people, that we know we have to interact with each country, perceiving and being aware of the differences of it. And I think we Portuguese, we always try to do that, to overcome the differences, not to become the other, but to interact and build a bridge with the other. We have so many things to do. I think we all said that we are in a new high in the bilateral relationships, but we are still at a very low point to what we can build.
What are you trying to do at this moment, at this beginning of this new phase, for
So
instance?
I would say we have three dimensions. The main one, I would say, has been economics and the economic realm. And we have three dimensions that have been working in different paces. The trade, and we, Portugal, we still have a long way to go in increasing our exports to China. Some new markets and some new products are being approved, but we have to do more, and we can do more in terms of fruit and meat, for instance. And in terms of investment, Portugal has been very open to Chinese investment, and we have received, I think, around 2 billion euros in the past years. The import, now we have been we import, I think, almost a double than we export to China, which is strange when China is a much bigger market than ours. So it means that we still have a long way to go.
Well, you were right in saying that China exports much more to Portugal than it imports from Portugal. But I have noticed that the trend is going, China is increasingly importing
Yes.
from Portugal, although the absolute volume is still smaller. How do you look at this balance, and how can we correct that balance?
Yeah, I believe that there is a major difference that impacts all this picture, because China is so big compared with Portugal. Well, it's so big compared with almost any country, so, but in the case it makes a difference. And also because we are a small country and China is too far away, I think that our companies, some of our companies that are already exporters, they are not still willing to do the effort that they have to do to invest the resources that they have to do in order to reach the Chinese market.
What do you mean by that?
As the example of Superbock, because you need several years to invest. So, but as we have more examples of companies that are being successful in the Chinese market, I believe that new companies will go there.
Again, is it a matter of putting the resources or the availability of resources, or is it a matter of cultural differences, the understanding lacking there?
Yes, all those dimensions are relevant. Yes, the lack of resources, but also the lack of examples, maybe in the enough number of good examples that other companies will do. But I believe that at least very few companies will explore much better the Chinese market and take all the advantages that they can take on that market. The cultural differences are a challenge, but also the size of the market, as Dr. Ferreira had mentioned, is a relevant question, because not all companies know that they have to have a very focused strategy for a specific region in order to start building their knowledge about the market.
Okay. Well, again, I'm very curious on this. So, in terms of behavior, in terms of strategy, or the way how they do things, are Chinese investors much different from their European counterpart when they come to Portugal? Have you paid attention to such aspects?
I haven't studied the issue specifically, but what we can see is that they, at least what we can understand is that Chinese investments have been in very specific areas, very strategic. For the time being, I don't know of any, but maybe there is some industrial investment, or at least partnership. I believe there must be some industrial partnerships, but mostly of the investments have been very focused on financial area, health and energy, which I believe are strategic areas of interest for the Chinese companies, and that makes sense, because that's what companies do around the world. They invest in areas that are strategic for them. So if they found those strategic interests and values in Portuguese companies in Portugal, this is very good for us, because we lack capital. So
can you tell us your experience, because you started 10 years ago, but you went step by step?
Of course, we had some failures. Of course, we had some learnings. Of course, we had to adapt. We had to adjust our strategy, our approach.
What was one strategy that didn't work out in the beginning?
For instance, a very simple example, to have more than one importer. It was clearly a mistake. It's something that has been working in other countries, but in China it didn't work.
So you had to have only one importer for the whole of China. Was it a cultural thing, or was it a business thing? Would you have done the same? And the principle or the main barrier?
Maybe it's a little bit of everything. I don't know. The reality is that it didn't work because we found out that it would stimulate too much trading on different regions. And what we have been doing is to invest on our brand credibility, which is not compatible with just trading between.
But in terms of dealing with Chinese business people, what's the interesting stories? What are some interesting stories you can tell us? Were there cultural faux pas that you committed, that you realized that you shouldn't do that again?
A very interesting thing that we realize is that when you get a commitment from a Chinese businessman, that commitment stays forever and alive. And eventually, even if not written, but if you have an ionized agreement, an ionized commitment, usually it works. And I found it very interesting because in Western world, let's say, I think it's rare and it's every day more difficult to rely on personal commitments.
I've read an article that said that to enter in China, you need to test and have courage and work. What this means?
You mentioned courage. It's something really important because due to the size of the market, you have to be able to make mistakes, to learn from them, but to accept that those mistakes, they are part of the process.
Mr. Amaro, in political exchanges, do you also need test, courage, and hard work?
I would say that we need it all, but we need, I would say, the most is an attitude of understanding differences. I would say that probably in all dimensions that we have been discussing here, the one where we have more differences is the political system. And I would say that if we focus on emphasizing those differences, we'll go nowhere. And probably Portugal would have taken the same attitude as other Western countries regarding Chinese investment. And there is that option, not working based on fear, as many countries do, but opting for a rule-based openness. And I think it's working out. Because on one hand, we see that investment growing, we see that trade improving, but there's a lot to do in the world in general. And this discourse and attitude that we have been seeing from China in general towards a more rule-based international order, it's also very important. I think we can work together in the international order. We can work together in some African countries, for instance, where opportunities for their own countries, and we can together, the two countries, China, Portugal, and those, mostly the Portuguese-speaking countries, bringing growth opportunities to those people and make their lives better as well. And of course, during all that time working in our self-interest of both countries. And we know, we have been seeing on the economic realm, on the cultural realm, we have both countries have some of the most spoken languages in the world.
Yes.
We are a very small country compared to China, it's true in terms of population, but we created a language and also a culture that's spread around the world.
Which is very interesting because if you look at the history of Portugal, it was not just the Portugal we're talking about. It's actually even today, right? I understand it's over 240 million people who are speaking Portuguese all over the world. Yeah, and China is having this massive effort of globalizing, of going out, reaching out economically, culturally, trying to build bridges between different people. So I want to ask you this common question. How can the two sides learn from each other? What can Portugal share with China in terms of globalization, and how can China maybe also share, what can China share with Portugal in this sense? Professor Africano.
Well, one area that I think it's important is really to invest on Western people and the common citizen to have a better idea of the developments that have been going on in China, because I think there is still a perception that maybe China is still a not so developed country. And one way of doing that is really the students, the exchange students, these exchange programs for students, because it's a way of, very simple way of learning about each other.
What are the Chinese students most interested in about Portugal, and vice versa? Are there Portuguese students going to China and studying?
Yes, fewer students, fewer Portuguese students go to China, because I think that there is still lack of awareness of what they can gain by going there. they have curiosity, but at the same time, it's so far away, so different. There are some fear. I think we need this kind of programs that will show China nowadays, because it's not something that we have access so easily. So I think it will be very interesting.
Again, allow me to ask this question maybe to all of you. How much is China talked about here within Portugal, in the domestic news, in the local media? How much understanding do the ordinary Portuguese people have about China? Daniela, do you talk about China from time to time?
Not so much.
Not so much.
Not
Why?
so much.
Why? Is it because China's so different, China's so far away, or people not directly having to do with China?
Although it's next to us, it's very far away. I think so. But let me...
On the business side, my feeling is that many companies are now discovering China, but they have no scale, no critical mass enough to invest in China, because it takes time, it takes resources, and probably something that would be very important for the business community in Portugal is cooperation. Because standing alone, it will be difficult for the most part of the small and medium enterprises to win in China.
Yeah.
I would say so. Going first to this last question, it is sufficiently spoken of China, probably not, and but we need relevant moments. People talk about and situations and countries are on the news when something happens. So the coming of the Chinese president will be a great occasion for the country to speak about. So it's the third president that comes to Portugal in the past 40 years, Chinese president. So we are excited and thrilled to have him, and it will be an occasion to discuss it. But also when some economic decisions are taken, as for instance, when the government that I was part of, a member of government at that time, and we had to decide on whether we would accept Chinese investment into strategic areas. There was a discussion in Portugal at that time. Very few people decided we should take the side of those that are more protectionist and more scared. As you listened in European debates, some people decided we should keep China away, and we should. So we took the main Portuguese parties, and I'd say the most important part of the Portuguese society took a different approach. We welcome if we can trust and if the offer is in our self-interest. And actually, I would say in all those cases, the Chinese offers in public tenders and public competitions were not only financially but also industrially better for Portugal. The Chinese paid a higher price, but they had a better business prospect for the country. The decision centers would stay here, the more jobs were created, and business expansion, and so on. But we also, your first question was about what can we learn in this globalist attitude and approach. I would say mainly two things. One is that the approach has to be of respect for the country that we are interacting with, and not a colonialist approach, not of submitting the other. And it's interesting how Portugal and China built upon that relationship, even in the past with the important territory of Macau. Portugal and China relationship should not be limited to Macau. It should be a country-to-country and a people-to-people interaction. But Macau is part of our history, and during the several centuries, Macau was not a colony of Portugal and China. There were at that time very strong and positive relationship and interactions between the Portuguese that were acting in China and the Chinese emperor, the Mandarins in the region, and so there was a relationship that was not of submission. And the other is that the interaction cannot be extractive. So when we go, a foreign country, China, when it goes to anywhere in the should not go to extract resources only in its self-interest. We believe, and I think that's the way we interact, we can act and engage with other countries in a way that both countries improve. Work on win-win approach.
I think that's what China advocates, and yet we are new on the different countries, on the different continents. So
I would say just when
it's
you
going
are
to be
so
a process.
big,
Yeah, there will be a process.
when you are so big, there's a risk of sometimes being like, we have this saying of an elephant on a China store, you know, like in English, like the idea that that's the risk, but it doesn't have to be like that. And the experience that we had, for instance, with the Chinese investment in Portugal in recent times is that China decided, and Chinese companies that invested in Portugal, they decided to play by the rules. And they succeeded in that.
I'm happy to hear that, that we are not the elephant in the new investor. But in terms of how to further improve this mutual trust, to further improve the understanding, what are some of your suggestions? I don't know what Professor Africano, whether you...
I think it's really knowing much more about the other reality, because people still have either stereotype ideas, because, for example, in Portugal, it's very common that we have lots of small Chinese shops owned by Chinese people that came from China. So the common citizen, those that don't travel or don't study some subjects or don't have businesses abroad, maybe they will still have an idea that China is this, that what they see here, the locals. Because, for example, one stereotype idea that it's very common, and I see that with that's reality with my students, is that when we are looking at the data for global trade, and we came with the data that only recently China became the major exporter in the world.
Yeah.
But then when I show the data about who are the biggest importers in the world, and they look at China in second place, just after the United States, they normally get, and they are students of economy and management, so they get surprised.
Yeah.
So this idea that, well, there is an invasion of Chinese products and the Chinese selling this are exporting too much. So this idea, it's a kind of misconceived idea because they see the products on a daily basis and they see the shops and there is this connection, and I think this raises actually even some fears, you know, and some political vision, affects some political visions. And I think we need more information and more knowledge about reality in order to have the proper perception of what's going on.
And also, when you talk about people not knowing China being a big importer, I think that is even going to be changed further, because China has just announced a major series of efforts and determination to open its market, right, to foreign goods. We had this China International Import Expo, a huge event. We were in Shanghai. I guess for businesses like Bock, it's going to be even more exciting time for you. Maybe more challenges as well.
We believe it will, but I have a specific suggestion. In order to get closer, in order to create even a different stage for our relationships. I think exchanging cultural events is crucial, because culture is a fantastic way of getting people closer. And we had a fantastic experience some months ago when we were commemorating the Portugal's Day in Beijing, and we took with us the Baroque Orchestra of Porto, and I think it was amazing to realize that suddenly 700 people in Beijing were enjoying the play of our Baroque Orchestra, knowing that Baroque music has been introduced in China by a Portuguese priest close to the Kangxi, I don't know if
Kangxi,
Kangxi Emperor. And I think this helps a lot to get people closer.
Looking ahead to your interaction with China, do you have any big goal, big ambition, or you really want to work on the small steps to further understanding of the Chinese culture or the political system, Mr. Amaro?
I would say it's a combination of both. The big goal is to foster this relationship of our country with this very old but trusted partner that China is in it, which is one of the largest countries in population, the largest country in the world, and one of the largest economies. But we know that a big goal is achieved by a number of small steps. And I would like to emphasize this last point of the cultural side. We have been talking a lot about economics. Next year, we will commemorate the 40 years of the resuming of the diplomatic relationship between the People's Republic of China and Portugal. And that opportunity is an opportunity also for a new stage. We had that new stage in the economic side, like I would say from 6 years ago. We have to do it in the cultural dimension. Because
what can we do, for example?
So these commemorations will have a festival, a Portuguese festival in China and a Chinese festival in Portugal. And we have to make it not one event only, but the beginning of a recurrent sum of events, so that both countries can enjoy some. These are our cultures, are two of the most ancient and stable and stronger cultures in the world. And we have to learn from each other. We have been doing that a lot, as Mr. Ferreira was saying, in the past, in our history, but we have to do it again by understanding the differences and that specific traits and experiences, a way of thinking and enjoying life that each country has, that we can also connect, and thereby our taste will connect to each other, and so we can stretch our relationship that way.
How do you look at the trend that there are, I believe, 200,000, over 200,000 Chinese tourists coming to Portugal last year? I think it was, I understand it was an increase of 40%. How important is that, and what kind of difference is that making to the local economy, Professor Africano?
Well, definitely it must be very important. The circumstances that were that during the period of our crisis, the tourism sector really boomed. And this was very important for slow down and make it the crisis not so harsh in terms of social impact, or even worse than it was. And tourism has been really developing very strongly in the last couple of years. So being able to capture Chinese tourists is really important, because this is an area of tourism around the world that is going to increase the most. Is the Asian area, is the one that is placed for biggest development in terms of emission of tourists. So people, huge amounts of the population that are increasing in their level of income, and they are willing to travel. So if we are able to capture one part of this development, it will be very important for our regional, local, and national economy, definitely.
What are some of the measures that are being put into place to facilitate the arrival of so many Chinese tourists? I mean, for instance, I don't know, if, here in Porto, the Chinese would love to have beautiful scenery and good wine, good food, you know, traditional architecture, but is the Portuguese population ready to welcome the influx of the Chinese?
I believe the population is ready for that. I don't know if the infrastructures are ready. We know, for instance, that in Porto we have a fantastic airport that is not overcrowded, which happens with Lisbon Airport. So I'm not going to argue about that, but of course we have to be aware that our infrastructure is scarce, and we should search for the best ways to drive Portuguese tourists to Portugal.
We know that a Chinese tourist likes to travel abroad and use one or two payment systems that are typical of China. Electronic payment systems that many Western European countries are not using, and I would say are less developed than those Chinese payment instruments. And I know there are some commercial outlets in Portugal, and that is spreading. They are developing such payment infrastructures so that Chinese can use that in a way they trust. And I would say we also have to be attentive that, according to the information we have, the Chinese tourism pattern is also changing. The way that Chinese are organizing themselves when they travel abroad. In the beginning, earlier times, they always traveled in packaged groups, and now it's changing. The recent numbers in international studies saying that Chinese more and more organize their own travel. They like some independent. We have a tradition in Portugal of being very friendly, hosting people. And even in terms of language, when people do not speak the language, they will even do sign language if they needed to adjust. And we know that people have very different habits. It's a fact that the Chinese tourism in Portugal is still very small. I would say 200,000 is less than 2% of all the tourists that we get. So it's a huge room to improve. But we know that we see, of course, beginning in the main cities of Lisbon and Porto, but it's spreading around, the companies that operate hotels, the tourism venues. There are
well, again, in terms of understanding, do you think that the Portuguese are having enough interest or to go and see China, you know, the other way around, not just the Chinese coming here to see Portugal? Because for me, if that is not happening, then again, they will not understand China. They will not know what they're talking about, who they're interacting with. Professor Africano.
Well, I believe the youngest generations, they will be very much interested, the ones that are aware of all development that is happening in China. So they will love to go to Shanghai. They will love to go to Beijing.
But what is missing from China to get us?
Okay. I think it's too far away and it is expensive. It is a challenge in that sense.
With the internet, it shouldn't be. Can it be made easier?
I know, but still, there is. I think there is a psychological distance, you know, perception of distance. So you feel that you are traveling for something that is quite different, that is the other part of the world, and you don't know very much. I've been in China a very long time ago, and my plan is to go now and see all the differences that have been built. So
I think we should, in our country, stimulate much more students to go to complete or to make their studies in China, as it is happening with Chinese people in Portugal. Some weeks ago, I realized that in a secondary school in Portugal, a private college, there are 60, in only one school, 60 kids, Chinese kids, studying here. So I think this is very important, so that in the future our people can understand each other much better and understand each culture on the other side.
How much is learning Chinese being done here in Portugal? I understand in some regions there are 8 or 9-year-old students who are being taught Chinese as a foreign language. But is there any plan to make that happen more, Mr. Amaro?
So our effort was, and we have to assume it, in terms of foreign languages, to bet on English first. And so in recent years, there was a decision by government and by main parties to initiate the learning of English as foreign language in the first year of elementary school. What we do as well is to stimulate schools to offer a second language. And there are some cases of course, of some private schools, but also some public schools that start offering Mandarin as a language, as Professor Africano was saying. With a younger generation, the interest is growing, and I would say that nowadays it's not the physical distance that is the strongest barrier, is the language. One of the things that impressed me the most when I was in China is it was probably at that time one of the countries where you would see less usage of foreign language. Many countries around the world are so small that people, in many dimensions, they shifted to English, and it's a result of the potency and the strength of the Chinese culture and language, of course, that people in China use mostly, and even I would say in their digital communications and media production, the Chinese language. And of course, even with the letters the alphabet is different, so we have to overcome the difference. So the work of a television like yours and the work of a television like Canal, to put even in that dimension of the communication, the two countries put together and trying to overcome that difference, I think it's a positive way to go.
Looking ahead, what would be one thing that you want to see improving in terms of exchanges in your daily work?
Probably getting higher numbers of students, Portuguese students, going to China.
Mr. Ferreira, what would be one thing you want to achieve in the near future when it comes to China, very briefly?
It would be important for us to have to exchange more people. Have Portuguese people speaking Chinese, Mandarin, and have Chinese people speaking Portuguese. In our days, we have needs of recruiting people with these skills, and it's not easy.
Okay.
One word I can say.
Yeah.
Ni hao.
Very good. That's a beginning. That's a start.
So on the political realm, exactly what I will be doing the next coming days, going to China on an official mission, and in this case the governments and the People's Congress and the Portuguese Parliament get together and get involved. But I would say the economic and cultural dimensions of interaction are the most important ones, I would say. It would be the cement of the relationship.
Okay, well, we have to wrap it there. Thank you so much to our panelists, and with that we come to this very special edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin, coming to you from Porto, Portugal. As always, you can follow us on Facebook and Twitter using the handle The Point with Alex. Download the application called CGTN to watch the show on your mobile devices, or go to YouTube and look for CGTN The Point. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Thank you. Thank you.